everyone. Welcome to episode 6 of your podcast Linguabees. These are Claudia and Ana Karen. In this episode, we will have a very interesting interview about phonetics, and we are honored to welcome a very special guest, Professor Neil Blomquist. So it's LeviOsa or LeviOsa.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. Let me introduce Professor Neil Blomquist, who is currently working at the Universidad Guanajuato, and his areas of expertise include the following: language learning strategies, teaching English as a foreign language, cognitive linguistics, second language acquisition, foreign language learning, English language studies, corpus linguistics, and of course, applied linguistics. Welcome, Professor Neil. We are pleased to have you in this podcast, and thank you for making the time.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
We are so happy to have you here. Could you please tell us about how your interest in the area of applied linguistics emerged?
Sure. Well, I don't know how different it is from a lot of us who are in the language teaching profession, but for me, I like learning language, and then I fell into teaching it. Originally, what I wanted to do was work in the United States in the high school system there, teaching literature. So I actually studied my undergraduate for an emphasis in teaching English literature. But then I ended up in Mexico and started teaching English, and of course, enjoying learning Spanish, and then eventually trying to learn other languages, and eventually working with beginners. Especially, it's something that I didn't think I would like in the beginning when I started teaching language, but I ended up liking working with beginners. At first, they kind of forced me into it, and I was like, oh man, I got to teach beginners, and I wanted to work with literature and advanced students, but I loved teaching beginners, and I also love learning other languages. I don't get very far, and I can't consider myself an expert, but starting to learn languages, I see difficulties in myself that I would see in my students, and so that cycle started where I would study something about how to learn language, how to teach it, and it was a nice little cycle of helping myself learn another language and then helping my students who are having difficulties learning languages, which was just a continuously developing passion for applied linguistics.
Thank you very much for sharing.
Yeah.
Well, and as we can see, you wanted to be a teacher, right? And at the end of the day, you're teaching,
Right.
English, but at the end of the day, you're still teaching, right?
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
thank you. So, also, we know that the terms phonology and phonetics might be confusing to a certain extent, right? Yet
Mhm.
important to distinguish. So, can
Sure.
you please tell us what is the difference between phonetics and phonology for our audience to have a clear example?
Sure. Well, it can get very confusing, but for our purposes, phonetics is usually when we look at individual sounds in a particular language, and work on how to produce those sounds mechanically. So we talk about our mouth and our tongue, and what we do with those to produce these specific sounds in the language. And then phonology is more encompassing and involves other aspects of pronunciation, which are, the segmental and super segmental aspects of language. So the individual sounds are the segments, and then the other aspects such as intonation, and well, word stress on a segmental level, and then sentence stress, what particular word you stress in a sentence, all get involved in phonology. And so phonology also studies how the rules that sort of connect all of those together, and how they are represented in the mind of the speaker and also of the listener. So it's all very interconnected, but the basic difference that sort of helps me keep it apart is phonetics are sort of the mechanics of producing sounds, and phonology are all of the different patterns and how those are represented in our mind.
Thank you very much for this really clear explanation between these two terms. You make it seems really simple when in fact when we were reading about it, it seemed really complicated to be honest for me. And maybe it will be it become more complex every time that we read it, even a little bit more
Sure,
of every each of the theme. One of the reasons that we want to get into this theme is because of its importance in applied linguistics, and as Schmidt suggests, every language has specific structural rules, which in a way govern the way sounds are allowed to come together to make words. So we understand that this area um, composes applied linguistics as a primarily integrated in the branch of second language teaching, as along with areas such as semantics, grammar, syntax, pragmatics, among others. So it is an important aspect as well in our area.
Exactly, Karen. So, on the other hand, Nasty in 1999 argues that there is something esoteric in phonetics and phonology, the objects they handle, right? Sounds, articulatory features, acoustic spectra, stress degrees, or melodies are more elusive and hard to observe for the non-specialists than, say, suffixes, word order, or even meaning. So, therefore, the validity of the phonetics phonology dichotomy itself may be questioned when it comes to their application, right? So, in this regard, Professor Neil, what can you tell us about the value of addressing phonology from an applied linguistic perspective, and what are some of its applications?
okay, well, I think there's a lot of applications, despite what many in the profession of language teaching might think. Uh, I work with teachers, so, and they think that pronunciation is important, but they find that once they start teaching that it's not important to particular programs or textbooks. And then when you look into it, it does get complicated, as you say. So it's a little bit problematic in applying a very big area and complicated area to the classroom. And so when dealing with it, I think it's important just to have clear goals uh, and um, and really, choose your battles wisely. So how do you do that? Well, how do I do it? I mean, so far it changes, and that's inevitable. But uh, in the literature and in my own practice, my goals are limited to intelligibility and listening comprehension. Now, everybody knows about intelligibility. I think everybody wants to be understood when they speak in the second language. But also an important aspect is listening comprehension. And so when it touches on those two, that's where it's important for me, and that's how I choose my specific recommendations. So I don't go through every sound in the English language on the International Phonetics chart. It's impossible. There's not enough time, and not all those sounds are really that important to produce correctly. And even when you say something like "produce it correctly," what does that mean? I mean, does that mean that they have to sound like a native speaker? And so that's where that issue of intelligibility becomes important. So if they produce a sound that affects their intelligibility, so in other words, any person listening, if they have problems understanding that person because of that particular phoneme, then that needs to be corrected. And likewise with any kind of uh, phonological aspect where you look at intonation, which isn't always important, but more important for me is word stress and sentence stress. So what specific words are you stressing, and what um, part of that word are you stressing, and when? So for me, distinguishing between the two isn't always what I do. I try to take it as a package and say, okay, well, this is important in this particular sentence. And I have some examples here. I don't know if you're ready. I know that's not really clear. It's really general, but but so for example, just to show you how it comes as a package, let's say, you're dealing with your title of this podcast is with the Leviosa, right? Leviosa. Are you guys fans of Harry Potter? Then
You could say so.
okay, well, I didn't know, but I had to go and look at that particular scene. I'm not a very knowledgeable about that world. But it's interesting that you chose that. Can I ask you, before I start, why did you choose that particular example?
Well, it is part of the pop culture.
Uh-huh.
You could say from a specific generation, and it is exactly about the importance of pronunciation of a word. So it's
Sure.
just a way of eliciting how there is, for some people, the like I don't want to be repetitive, but for some people it's really important to pronunciate, or the pronunciation of some words are really important. I'm sorry, that
Yeah.
was really redundant, but yes,
Well, I think I
that's
know
what we
what you're
wanted to
saying.
say. Uh-huh.
Yeah. Well, I'm wondering, what you guys think. I mean, do you think Hermione is right? I mean, should she be so strict on that particular word? Do you think that's an important word to correct there?
That's one of our following questions, in fact, about the point of view between prescriptivist and descriptivist.
Yeah.
And in this case, we could see as Hermione as a prescriptivist point of view.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know how it really works in that world. What makes a spell work? So I guess just speculating, not and showing my ignorance about that world, but how does a spell work or not work? Like what makes the feather? So for those who haven't seen that scene, Hermione is sitting next to Ron, and they're working on trying to get a feather to levitate, and so they have to say it, and Ron can't get it to work, and so she corrects him. She's like, it's not working because of your pronunciation. So let's assume that whatever makes that feather levitate is some sort of like spirit world. There's spirits that lift it up. So did those spirits not understand the specific word that
Yes.
Ron was trying to say, and there that would be important. And so she's right. There was a listening comprehension problem on the part of the spirits. They just didn't understand. They're fluent speakers of Latin, and that didn't work. However, I would find it difficult to you know imagine that they didn't understand the difference between Leviosa and Leviosa, unless there were other like another part of the phrase which would make it complicated, or it indicated some kind of past tense where there wouldn't be a past tense, something like that. But it seems to me that that would not be a really important issue, but it could be, and in this case, it seems to me because the spirits didn't understand and didn't raise the feather. So intelligibility was key, and so maybe she was right. That it was part of the spell, and it needed to be pronounced correctly. So that's what's key for me is intelligibility, and so when you speak to be understood. But also, on the other hand, I think something that doesn't get enough emphasis in the classroom and in the literature is that aspect of listening comprehension. So our ability as second language learners to understand what is being said to us based on difficult pronunciation rules. So maybe an example would help here. So something that I work on more than like all the individual sounds that are different in English. I like schwa. I think schwa is a really, really important sound, and it goes hand in hand with what you're doing in a segmental level and in a super segmental level. So word stress and sentence stress. So for example, in the literature, this one of the top guys right now is Levis, and he talks about how these little words, these function words, can be quite difficult, and they don't get enough attention. So we're talking about words like in, at, on. Um, uh, is a big one for me. So is a word, and so I teach the word before a, the letter, because if my students have and talking about phonology, if they have this conceptualized idea that this word is pronounced as a when it really in reality is almost never produced as a, it's produced as and it's not stressed, that can affect both their intelligibility and their ability to comprehend the message that people speak to them. So other words I think that are really important are words like to. So they have this concept. Okay, we teach them to, and that can be to, especially for the pronunciation of an infinitive, like to go, where we teach to, but we pronounce it ta with a schwa because it's unstressed. So there's this interrelation between not stressing a word and then a reduction of the vowel. So the vowel is changed from to ta. And this happens all the time. So my example sentence that I'll give you just to illustrate this is, you can go, but I don't want to go to the store today. Now that's, I read it and pronounced it the way maybe some teachers would read it and pronounce it carefully so that the students would understand all of that. But there's lots of interaction between the sentence stress and word stress and vowels being reduced to schwa. So that's why schwa is really important to me, because when I say it naturally and fast, I say, you can go, but I don't want to go to the store today, right? So it's full of schwas. It makes it sound really fast. And in my experience working with beginners, seems to be something that makes it difficult to understand. Not that they have to produce that, but just so that they know that, hey, there's this schwa sound that exists in English that doesn't exist in Spanish, and it can cause some complications. And so, but it can cause complications, according to Levis, when, for example, can, that word is reduced. So I say I can, or you can. So it's can in an actual flow of speech. But when it's emphasized as can, many native speakers, especially from North America, will understand can't. Because when we say can't, we usually keep that vowel as the pure original vowel and not reduce. So we say can't. So sometimes we clarify, like you can or you can't. But in the normal flow of a conversation, so if I say you can go, we understand can, puedes. But if I say you can't, then that's no puedes, right? So it can make a difference in that sense. So that's why the schwa and sentence stress and word stress are really, really important. And the same thing with want to. It's really, really rare for native speakers to be talking to each other and to say want to, right? Almost all of them say wanna, right? And so why does that happen? So, because to is a small word and it gets reduced to a schwa. And in special cases, we even just take the T out. We don't need the T. We'll just get rid of the T too and just keep the schwa, wanna. And that can be really complicated for beginner learners. That's one of the things that I work with. So how do I do that? One of the ways is that I if you look at a normal textbook or even a book that specializes in activities for teaching pronunciation, they'll say, okay, well, here's one thing you can do. Teach them to emphasize the big words. the important words of the sentence. So you can go. So you would be important there, but I don't want to go to the store today, or today, maybe store and today would be big ones. But I find a big part of that also, especially for Spanish speakers, is not emphasizing those little words, because that can cause some problems. It changes the vowel, and it also can change how that person is being understood. So I say, don't emphasize those big words. Don't put an accent in the overall flow of the sentence. Don't say to. I want to go. That would be something that could be a little confusing, because the speakers are the listeners rather are expecting to, and so they're expecting a certain vowel, and for it to not be stressed. So it's a really complete package, and a lot more complicated, but I try to make it not as complicated by working with specific phrases, rather than always just isolated words or isolated sounds as represented on the IPA. But I do teach schwa, and I teach the symbol and everything, the weird upside down E. And I'm like, this because there's no other way to represent it. It's just like, and it's a cool looking symbol. So I was like, I'm always telling my students, hey, there's this weird symbol. It's a sound. It doesn't exist in Spanish, but it's really important. It's the most common sound in the English language, and it really is everywhere. And it's important to be able to at least recognize it and sometimes produce it.
Thank you very
Yeah.
much for such contribution. Actually, I think that's the reason why we call this episode the way we did, because we wanted to hear a perspective from a professional, right? And as you said, it's important to let the students also know, like, sometimes we do not emphasize that much on pronunciation, so it depends on some other features as word stress, etc. What you just mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's go with the IPA, International Phonetic Alphabet. You mentioned it before.
Sure.
And well, phoneticians vary in their opinions on the theoretical validity of speech segments, right? So segmentation, seems to be considered troublesome if the goal is to represent exactly the level of detail that is visible in the acoustic waveform, because acoustic segments often do not correspond one-to-one with a phonetic segmentation. So this leads to the next question. Do you consider IPA to be useful in the classroom? Maybe it's a little bit redundant here, but we would like you to share your opinion here. And what would you recommend to those who want to use it, either for teaching purposes, contrast analysis, or learning?
I think every teacher should know the sounds that are represented on the International Phonetic Alphabet. It's not that hard. A lot of them are easy symbols, and it can really help you distinguish what is important and is not important. And so oftentimes it is quite important. So understanding the difference between what we would call like the long I and the short I can be important in being understood. It's not always important, but I think it's important for teachers to be able to recognize those sounds and their graphic representation. The International Phonetic Alphabet is a brilliant accomplishment, and there are other versions that they tried before that. If you care to see one of those versions, it comes out in a movie, and it's called My Fair Lady. From the 60s. It's a great movie, all about pronunciation. And in this case, the importance of not only specific phonemes as represented on their particular phonetic chart, but also just the societal aspects of it. Like what happens when you change somebody's pronunciation? Can they move up in society? So it's a great concept for a movie and based on an older book. But so if you see this chart in that movie, it's really confusing, especially compared to the one we have now, divided by consonants and vowels. So it's very useful. But as I said, I don't use any of those symbols for my students except for the schwa. just because I think the schwa is so important, and it's a cool looking symbol, and it seems pretty easy for them to remember. So that's the only one I use specifically with the students, but as a reference for teachers, I think it's absolutely uh, important, and it's great because if you have a doubt, then you can look up a word, and instead of looking at the very confusing ways that some dictionaries represent the pronunciation of that word, like for like they'll write out for A-H instead of one of the specific representations of that, of the sound of that word based on the IPA. So it's very clear, and so yeah, I think it's indispensable. I don't know if was there another part of your question?
No, that's okay. I would say just that the Shoah is such a headache for language learner students, but yeah, it is important and essential to learn it,
Yeah,
to understand it. Actually, since especially we Mexicans, we do not have that in our alphabet, right? But yeah.
right.
Mhm.
It's a headache, but it's one of those things that doesn't have to be. You know what I mean? Because it's not that hard to make. It's easy to describe it. It's like but you don't open your mouth as much. You know, you just keep your mouth closed. You can have them clench their teeth and just say you know, and that keeps them from opening their mouth, which is the tendency for Mexican speakers, is to just turn it into an a. So to say instead of so I have them practice that. For example, with the t and the and other words where it's important based on where the stress is in the word. For example, like a word like Canada, that's a fun one to practice, right? Because there's a stressed part of that word, and that a is a in North American English, an a, or more of the British a. I can't do it the way all of their different accents represent that letter, but it's really obvious, I think, in the North American pronunciation of that word, where it's can and then ada. So unstressed, the two unstressed parts of that word are schwas. And so it's fun to kind of present those words and be like, okay, well, where are the schwas here and why? And if you teach them the rule, and that is a rule, uh, a lot of times the words with many syllables will, the reduction in syllables to schwas almost always occur on unstressed syllables of the word. And then get that. It's a nice rule to be able to examine every once in a while. So of course I'm not going to have a whole class that we're studying this. We don't have time for that. But every once in a while, just recall that to their attention and say, oh, remember, this word like Canada or Japan, where's the stress? So Japan, it's on the pan. So remember it's Japan. So remember, put that stress on that. And so it becomes essential, and you get a 2-for-1. You're dealing with word stress and vowel reduction at the same time, and almost every time that vowel reduction is on the unstressed syllable to a schwa.
Yeah, and now you have us here, Karen and myself, just practicing Canada, Japan, and just try
Yeah,
Yes.
it's fun. Yeah, it really is kind of a fun part of it, and they have fun practicing that and realizing it. And it's something that we talk about in pronunciation and in the literature, just raising that phonemic awareness. So once, because it's easy to ignore the schwa, and I don't think that should happen. I think we're doing a disservice if we're just like, yeah, you just produce it however you want. I mean, that's true for a lot of different things, and it's okay to have an accent as long as people understand you and you understand other people. But when it affects intelligibility and comprehension, as I feel like the schwa does, I think it's important to raise that phonemic awareness and have them understand there's a sound in English that is important to know, and it matters to pronounce it correctly in a lot of different words and in a lot of different sentences. So yeah, schwa.
Thank you very much, Professor Neil, for this amazing conversation about
Thank you.
uh, about phonetical awareness, about intelligibility, about everything that we have discussed in this brief, maybe brief 30 minutes, but we know that we can even take longer time to discuss this really interesting conversation. But I would like to address our last question.
Sure.
And for that, as mentioned before, we know there are two different perspectives regarding the use of language, and those are the prescriptivist and the descriptivist. We
Hmm.
mentioned that with Hermione and Ron scene.
Right.
Uh, while from the prescriptivist point of view, as we said, the use of the language falls into the correct and incorrect spectrum, and the descriptivist sees the language as it is actually used and not how it must be used.
Hmm.
So, what can you tell us about these perspectives in terms of phonology? You have mentioned already something about how it relies on the intelligibility, if I said it correctly. And but what can you tell us a little bit more about this? Does it matter if someone says LeviOsa or LeviOsa?
Yeah, it's a. I think that was a bigger issue in the past, especially with the British English. Uh, in that country, there was such a difference in class as represented by pronunciation. If you see My Fair Lady, you really can see that. And so they developed this sort of pronunciation that they said, okay, this is the correct pronunciation. But they just basically pulled it out of a hat, and they're like, okay, this is how the elites and educated people talk, and they called it received pronunciation, and they really emphasized that instruction in the educational system there, and of course abroad. So the United Kingdom was very active in trying to get other colonies and countries in general to learn English. And of course, they were going to emphasize this received pronunciation. So I think at that time it was a really big deal. And of course, now we're on the other side of that reaction against that. And even in their own country, I can't give you the specific citation, but there is a citation that says there are less than 2% of the people that live in the United Kingdom that actually use received pronunciation. One of the examples that they use is that it was more common to hear that kind of pronunciation, also known as the Queen's English, which I think they still use. So if you really want an example of that, just listen to the Queen when she did speak, or any of their family. They still have that pronunciation, and often in movies because that's what we expect. But that received pronunciation was more common, for example, in the BBC. So all of the people that would come on that radio, they would insist, hey, you have to speak right. You have to use received pronunciation. But now you hear all kinds of accents and received, other than received pronunciation on the BBC. So I think it's less important, but it's still a conversation that happens. And so, what pronunciation do you teach? What's right? What's correct? And you can't say. I mean, and most of us are always going to have an accent in the second language in one way or another, unless we start very young and have lots and lots of input and practice. So there is no correct pronunciation. There is only the way people talk in various native speaking countries, and all of the accents that people have in English as a second language. And as long as they're intelligible, and as long as they understand what people say to them, whether they're native speakers or not, that's the key. And I think, just on another note, it's I think interesting and fun too. You know, I mean, not always just worrying about, oh, is it correct or not, or is it the best way, but just having fun with it, you know, and playing around with different accents. And there's so many wonderful accents in English, and the same goes for Spanish, where when they teach Spanish in the United States, it's common to have this imposition of the Spanish accent from Spain, and only what they told me is more of a Madrid accent. And even in Spain, you know, not everybody likes that accent, besides not using it. And so, but you know, that happens in Texas. I heard that there's that kind of imposition in the Texas schools, where there's so much influence from Mexico and so close to Mexico. It just seems crazy to me that they would do that. Let people choose and play, and there's so many wonderful accents from even within Mexico. You know, how could anybody say, oh, this is the right accent in Spanish in Mexico, much less all of the Spanish speaking world? So I don't know. I think sometimes that's instead of worrying so much about that, realizing, hey, it's about being understood and understanding, and having fun with it. And I try to emphasize that with my students, at least. It can be a really fun process to try accents, you know, and just try them out and see what happens. Imitate some of your favorite speakers of the language, and just have fun with it without worrying too much about being right. But that aspect of being understood is correct, is essential. And if we can give corrective feedback when we don't understand a student, that is really, really essential to do, in a great service that we can do as teachers.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Indeed, phonetics and phonology, it's like such an interesting topic, right?
Wow.
Well, thank you, Professor Neil, for being
Thank
part of
you.
the sixth episode of our podcast, Linguabees. We really appreciate your time, your comments, and contributions. Okay.
All right. Thank you. It was great to be here.
Phonetics and phonology are an essential part of the process of language learning. As discussed in previous episodes, one of the main roles of applied linguistics is to identify and attain problems related to the language. So it is a pleasure for us to have had the opportunity to talk with Professor Neil, who elucidated several aspects in this regard. Thank you for listening. Stay tuned, and we'll be back soon with another episode of your podcast, Linguabees, because applied linguistics is for everybody.
This podcast is part of the Applied Linguistics Master's Program at the University of Guanajuato in Mexico. This episode was produced by Natalia Carolina González Marentes. Claudia Ingrid Pérez Maldonado and Ana Karen Ocampo Márquez are the co-hosts.
This episode was edited by Alondra Juárez Hernández and Patricia Linares Flores. The script was written by Dulce Anayeli de Anda Vargas. The social media managers are Alejandro Aguilar Arriaga and Carlos Silva Rayas.